Hi, guys. Well, I'm actually very honored to be with you all. I've been at DePaul since 2013, and I was just saying to a colleague, I wish I had more interaction with the members of the Black community from DePaul. So hopefully, this is the start of something that is more frequent. I want to start with a little bit of background on me so that you can contextualize why this is something that I find myself passionate about as I talk to students and other people in the DePaul community. And by the way, happy Black History Year, because we don't limit ourselves to 28 days out of the month. Just in terms of background, I am a undergrad from North Carolina A&T. After North Carolina A&T, I lived in New York and worked in accounting in what at the time was considered a big six accounting firm. So I worked at Deloitte for a few years, and then I went to the University of Chicago and got an MBA in finance and accounting and went to Wall Street for more than a decade. While I was at JP Morgan, in the private bank, which is the division of Morgan that is the wealth management arm, I ran the University of Chicago and Northwestern recruiting team, and I sat on the compensation committee for the group. So, a lot of how I think about these issues that I'll talk about tonight were formed from the experiences that I had as a Black professional breaking into an environment that had not seen a lot of color ever. And then from being a manager and having to a number of issues that came up with interns, with junior people, and as well as some of the issues I had to see with senior people. While I was at Morgan, I started teaching in the training program and decided, I really like this. I was at a time when the markets were really uh, very volatile. There was a lot of downsizing, right sizing, and I used that as an opportunity to go get a PhD in accounting. And after being at Rutgers for a number of years, I came to DePaul because I believe in the mission of the institution. And so here I am, and I want to start um, by talking about what the problem is, because everyone on this call in some way has experienced what I like to call, or what scientists would call, workplace trauma. Now, some of you may call it workplace drama, but it certainly is workplace trauma. So we want to talk about what is it that you're experiencing so that when we move into the question and answer session, we can frame it around those kinds of things. So I want to start really quickly with a share, because I think this is for us to understand. Bear with me as I put my professor hat on really quickly. So all of us probably experience something that I will term cognitive bias. I'll come back to the word cognitive in just a second. A lot of times in our workplace or on the news or whatever, we hear this framed as implicit bias. The problem is that what many of us experience in the workplace is not always implicit. Sometimes it certainly is explicit bias. So, what is cognitive bias? It's important to understand that cognitive bias is a person using stereotypes, using the way they think about the world to frame you in a way that may prohibit your success in the workplace. Again, sometimes that is implicit, sometimes it's explicit. So, we'll talk a little about that. There is also something that is a little bigger than that, which is what many of us experience in our lives. And sometimes that is racism, which can be more systemic. We'll talk about how to frame systemic racism. And then there is the more day-to-day discrimination that we experience. The reason why we have to be able to frame the issue is because when we have human resources challenges, we have to be able to define it appropriately so that we can resolve the situation in a way that reduces the bias that we encounter on a daily basis, because they manifest in the workplace in many different ways. Some of you all in the last 6 months are probably working in corporations that are doing things like mandating implicit bias training, mandating anti-racist training. Well, I'm going to be quite frank. In my opinion, a lot of those things don't work, because while you can mandate that someone be trained, you cannot mandate that someone be transformed. Okay? Because in order to move ourselves past a number of the situations that many of us find ourselves in, we need transformation of people. Now, how we do that is often beyond me. But what I will say is nearly every organization that we work in, that we participate in, there is some of this, cognitive bias that we have to overcome, whether it's academia, corporate America, or whatever. So as I was coming into today, I was dealing with a challenge that reminded me that these things are a constant. So I'll use this as a frame that some of you might want to, a lens that some of you might want to think about your own experiences through. So I am a member of a group that's called the PhD Project. And for those of you who may not know about the project, the group was founded in order to diversify business classrooms. So to encourage people to get PhDs in the business disciplines, because if you've ever been in a business school, you don't see many folks that look like you. So I am a relatively, what I would say, senior person in the group for the accounting of faculty. And I got a call about a situation with a PhD student who was withdrawing from a program at a major university, and she had some, what I will call, workplace trauma, and we were trying to determine what actually happened. Because the microaggressions that she was facing, when I heard about it, I knew exactly what it was. It's cognitive bias manifesting in the workplace, whereas the people on the other side of the desk are saying to her, are you sure you really heard that? Or, I wouldn't be so quick to think about it like that. So I often use in some of the training and discussions that I'm doing, and I'm going to share something with you that's called the pyramid of white supremacy, because again, we have to learn to call a thing, right? Because there are levels to how we think about what is facing us really in the context of this present space, which we're in a particularly fraught time, right? Typically in an environment, we do not get to the top of this pyramid, right? But what we see over the last year or so is that some of what we have encountered and endured in the workplace and our neighborhoods has started to ascend to that. And no, we're not at the top, but we are in a place where some lines have been crossed. We have to be able to talk about it. And yes, some of these things do spill over into our workplace. So a part of what this student was encountering is what I will say is the bottom half of the pyramid, which is what most of us face in the workplace. So indifference, people want to avoid confrontation. They may be privy at a work event to someone making a racist joke and they smile because they don't want to challenge that person because of the space that person occupies. Um, they want to not be called out, so they just will be quiet. Then there's minimization. And minimization is when, in this woman's case, she called something out, and on the other side of the desk, they're telling her, well, it was just a joke. Well, we live in a post-racial society. Well, these people aren't really racist. Why can't we just get along? So that's minimization. And we often face this in workplaces where we're on islands as the lone person of color, or maybe one of a few. And these things happen, and we're often told we're not experiencing what we know to be we're experiencing. And then it moves into this idea of veiled racism, which is not necessarily systemic. It's what happens in the workplace where you might be a token and your job might be happy for you to be the only one, because it allows them to say, well, we got one person of color in here. They may claim that there is no such thing as what you're experiencing. In a different way, they may blame you for what is happening. Well, it must be your fault. Or you may be in an open environment where folks just make racist jokes. So I like to give the experience. So the JP Morgan Private Bank manages the wealth of the wealthiest people in America and around the world. And I was in a group where I spent a lot of time traveling abroad. I was on a flight with someone I worked with, and he asked me, do you eat chitlins? Now, you might say, what in the world does that have to do with anything? Well, because he knew I didn't eat pork. So if you know that someone doesn't eat pork and you ask them, do you eat chitlins? Because your assumption is that, well, she's Black, she must be a chitlin eater. Of course, she eats chitlins and she's from the South. Well, where does that fit, right? And when you call a person on it and they say, oh no, that's not what it is, and you shouldn't speak to him like that or about him like that, we also see these kinds of tone and rebuttal policing, and that would be considered veiled racism. Now, discrimination is something that we often experience at school, okay? Even in a university setting. Discrimination is what we might face in the hiring process. There was just a study done in Chicago where, on the temporary employment industry, where the architects of this study had multiple people, temporary agency, to apply for a job. Black men were told there is no job. Hispanic men were sent out to a job site, right? That's discrimination, right? We see it in schools. We see it sometimes when, we are applying for jobs. Let your name, have a lot of letters. You may be subject to racial profiling in the application process. That would be hiring discrimination. Some of us experience this in, there was a recent story about a Black couple who they were looking to refinance. Their house wasn't appraised for a value that they knew it to be. They had their white friend to act like she was the owner, and then it all of a sudden appraised for hundreds of thousands of dollars more. So that's discrimination. And again, it can occur in the workplace. It can occur walking down the streets of Chicago. I live in River North. I go into my apartment building. The doorman says, hey, Steph, how are you? I get in the elevator, and then someone who was behind me holds their purse, right? That is the kind of stuff that we see in our places of existence. Now, calls for violence and genocide, while they are rarer, what we know is that in the United States, these calls for violence and now violence actually are manifesting in the public domain. So we cannot be ignorant as to the fact that these things do happen, and we cannot allow uh, folks to tell us we aren't seeing what we're seeing, particularly in areas of police brutality. While you say I showed up to think about or to talk about things in the workplace, well, if you work in a building that you are going to your office at night, and maybe you've forgotten your ID or not, and it turns very quickly from a situation of you being profiled to them calling, let's say, the CPD, that can go from, you know, veiled racism to discrimination to violence very quickly. So we have to be aware of this whole notion of what is happening, how do I call it, where does it fall? And one of the things I want to bring your attention to is in a pyramid, every brick depends on the ones below it. So we cannot have discrimination in the workplace unless there are people who are first indifferent to the behaviors of people in the workplace. So if you remove the bricks at the bottom, the whole structure then starts to tumble down. And so when we are working on anti-racist training and cognitive bias training and implicit bias training, what I meant when I said was training is not important unless it is married to transformation, is as long as people act indifferent, then we don't make progress. So the next thing that I want to show is this circle that comes from the National Equity Project. And it talks about this cycle that we often face from a community standpoint. So implicit bias, right? Sometimes it is explicit. We acknowledge that. But these cognitive biases that we face, it's a loop, right? It's a feedback loop. So structural racism, because it exists, leads to implicit bias, and implicit bias feeds the loop back to structural racism. So when we start to think about these things, I want to talk about how this feedback happens, because we have a history of policies and practices in this country that are inherently racist, that play a role in our workspace that we often don't realize. I'll give you an example. And this is a very simple example that you may not even understand how racism is in play. Chicago, it snows a lot, right? If you drive to work and you have a snowy day that you're driving to work in, your ability to get to work on time may be impacted by the structural racism of how the city decides to shovel out neighborhoods, right? So if your boss lives in downtown Chicago, which is obviously going to be shoveled out faster, and you're late to work, their perception might be you're late to work because you started late, and you're late because, well, you know, Black folks are just always late. Not thinking about the fact that you live in a neighborhood that the city by design does not shovel out equitably with the rest of the city. So there's a problem. That's how structural racism feeds into a person's implicit bias. So it's a circular kind of thing, right? Now, when we start talking about how these things work, I like to frame for people. I grew up in the Southeast. I lived in New York. I've lived in Chicago. This is the second time that I've lived here. And Chicago is one of the most residentially segregated places I have ever lived. That segregation is by design. That segregation, coupled with the fact that we have things in Chicago like food deserts, right? Like inequitable access to trauma centers. So if you live on the South Side, you might think I'm rambling, but all of this stuff plays a role in whether or not you're well when you go to work, whether or not you have the resources to withstand the systemic bias, right? Because here's a fact: systemic bias, cognitive bias, systemic racism make us sick. If we are being made sick by the structures in place, but we have less access to healthcare, trauma centers don't exist for the most part on the South Side of Chicago. If you get into certain kinds of medical situations, you got to come north. Well, the likelihood of your condition deteriorating goes quicker, right? You will deteriorate faster because you have to go further. Now, because you had to go further and you have deteriorated, the ER physician says you can't go to work tomorrow, and your boss just decides you just want to be at home, right? So these are the kinds of things that we have to talk about: the histories, the policies, and the practices that lead to the inequitable outcomes and racial disparities that we face in education, that we face in the public domain, and of course, that we face in our workplace, right? And that feeds into often assumptions. And remember, in someone's mind, perception is reality, right? And so, with that being said, I know this is like one of these things that we would be better off me hearing your questions. But one of the things that I will say is some of the specific cognitive biases that we encounter often are ingrained in our own community, and in our workplace, we have to overcome that as well. So, how do we deal with interaction, especially when it's a generational gap between us and older or younger people that we have to encounter in the workplace? How does that play into our workplace trauma? And then, of course, some of that perpetuates racism, and we can talk about how to overcome it. So I will stop here because this has now been, 20 minutes or so of me rambling. What I like to do, Ruthie, is to go to questions now. So I think questions are coming through the chat. So you can start feeding the questions to me.
Okay, so I just put a prompt in the chat. If y'all, I know that this was a lot from Dr. Mason. So if y'all have questions, we would really love to start with the questions. So we do have one right now for you, Dr. Mason. So thank you so much. It is, I thought younger generations were less biased. What do you think?
So while there is evidence that would say they are less biased in some respects, there's also a lot of academic evidence that would say that there is, racial bias continues to, exist in America. This is anecdotal, but I think if you look at January 6th, 2021, a lot of young people that were there in parts of America, there is a bastion, I will say, of younger people who have not been transformed. So I'm going to say this like a Southern person: you home, right? To the extent that we are raising children, and the people who have been transformed in our circles, who may not look like us, I think in certain parts of my connection might be a little unstable. To the extent that some of us are raising kids in more aware environments, Yes, but how you frame racism is a very interesting thing. So I can, if you want to have a follow-up question, I can come back to that.
Okay, thank you so much. The person who asked the question, they said that they thanks and that they agree. So the next one is a little bit more of a comment. And it says, it's evident that when areas are discovered, and we're talking about like Christopher Columbus style discovered, all of a sudden there's no food deserts and the streets are clean. So can you talk a little bit about that? I think we might want to call that gentrification, right?
Yes. So, someone once called it gentrification. And I said, no, what it is moving into places that 10 minutes ago you didn't want to live in until you realized the gems that were there. That's what I like to call them. Because the word gentrification implies that there was something wrong with the neighborhood, right? There was nothing wrong with the neighborhood. The neighborhood was fine, right? Sometimes we are perfectly fine where we are, but when other folks discover it, service providers want to follow them. So that leads to neighborhood trauma, right? Because sometimes when these businesses come, the businesses bring their set of cognitive biases with them that can lead to mistreatment and eventually misplacement or displacement, I should say, of people who were longstanding members of the community. This is not an issue that is unique to Chicago, but certainly what's happening in Chicago, particularly in the south and the west side of the city, is where we see people being pushed out. So what happens, the food desert needs to exist, but then so do the native population of that neighborhood. So then where do we often go to other places that have food deserts and medical deserts. And so we have to figure out ways to hold the people that we pay taxes to accountable to us as well.
All right. So, Dr. Mason, you have hit me with the most truth out of any DePaul professor's mouth that I have ever heard in my 4 years there. And so, if anybody else is on this panel, jaw is to the floor, wanting you to pour more information into us, I would like you to, can you tell us how, impart some wisdom on us? Because you've been doing this for a while. You've been in these circles, you've been out of these circles. I mean, you've moved in them so many different ways. So can you give us some wisdom, something that you've learned that you don't mind sharing with us? And I'm not going to say to help us get through or to help us cope, because we're better than that, but you know what I'm trying to get at. Can you hit us with some more wisdom?
Yeah, so one of the things that I had said, we have to learn to call something what it is. I'm not saying be confrontational, but we got to call things what it is. And we have to do it for our health's sake, right? And the reason I say this is because we often hold our peace to the point that it's called psychosomatic illness, right? So we end up making ourselves sick by holding in the trauma that we face, and it manifests for us in things like high blood pressure, migraines, all these things. I'm guilty of it myself, right? So I've had health issues that come from trying to be a good steward of whatever someone else's reality. So what I've had to learn to do is to have conversations with people one-on-one about why their behavior is not okay. And also this is hard, and I can say this at 50 that I might not have been able to say this at 30. Sometimes the answer is this is not the environment for me, and that the pursuit of this dream cannot be so important that I have to compromise my mental and physical health for it. And some of you work in environments like those environments too. And in this moment of reckoning, the only way we get transformation is that we help people understand that their behavior is implicitly not okay, explicitly too, right? That what they're saying or doing is not okay. So I'm going to tell a little story. So when I was at Morgan, I was sitting on the compensation committee, but because I ran the University of Chicago and Northwestern recruiting, there was a committee of all the people that ran the recruiting teams that would decide which interns received offers. Now, all of you know, if you receive an intern offer, if you become an intern at a bank, an accounting firm, a large consumer products company, most often, unless you blow it up and they have slots to give, they're going to offer the interns slots first because it's less costly to them than to go back to campus and hire new people. So we were sitting in this meeting and we were just making decisions, and there was a Black MBA student from Columbia University in New York that they decided, well, she's not a good fit. This is often a word that is used in the rooms to talk about us because it doesn't keep them on the hook for saying anything that could be misconstrued. She's not a good fit. So I wanted to know, like, well, what's wrong with her, right? Because she seems to be one of the hardest working people I know. And they said, well, um, you know, she doesn't go out to lunch with us because y'all don't ask her, right? It's not that she's not a good fit. You decided that you didn't want to ask her. So that has workplace implications. So it was in that space that I had to start thinking about, okay, I got to call this what it is. With the situation I had with the PhD student, same kind of thing. The way you all behave towards her, is biased. Now, I wanted to say it's racist, but let's start the conversation somewhere, right? And the other thing is, we have to be advocates for each other. And when someone is being offended in place, often behind their backs, we have to be the one to say that's not okay. I know that's a lot, but, and that probably, Ruthie, goes beyond what you were asking. But what I say is we have to learn to call a thing a thing.
Okay. So Professor Mason, before you go to the next part of your presentation, we have one more question from Yosha. Hey, Yosha.
Okay.
Yosha said, can you give any advice for mid-level Black workers who want to grow and move up while combating this? And I think Yosha works in finance, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. So here's one thing that I will say. First is we have to, my mom used to say, you got to know thyself, right? And what I mean is we have to be very good at taking an inventory of our skills to see if those skills match who we are on the inside. One of the reasons that it became easy for me to leave Wall Street is because the person that I am on the inside was much more nurturing than what my corporate persona needed me to be, right? So, Yoshi, one of the things that I will say is find someone who is willing to be a mentor and find someone who is willing to be a sponsor. And a mentor and a sponsor are not necessarily the same person. A sponsor is someone who is willing to go on the line to help bring you manage your career upward, right? A mentor is someone who is going to tell you how to make improvements to what you're doing, either from a work product standpoint or what your brands looks like in your organization. And so a lot of times the mentors that I had were more senior Black women, right? Because that's what we do. Unfortunately, we mother the world. This is often how we end up giving other people the tools to bypass us in a corporate setting because we are so nurturing. So finding someone who can help you nurture your brand. That's what I'll call it. But also finding someone who is willing to be your sponsor and your advocate as you are attempting to climb. Sometimes this requires you to do some uncomfortable things when it comes to sponsorship, like scheduling lunches with people or coffee that you would not ordinarily want to go out to lunch with. Start picking their brains, start having regular conversations with them, and you'll find out really quickly if they're interested enough in you. Because after the first or second time, when you say, hey, can we do this again? If they're looking hesitant, move on to the next person, because that person is not likely to be your sponsor. If they aren't comfortable enough to have lunch with you, then they're probably to be the one to say, hey, this person I think is deserving of this opportunity. The other thing is you should keep your tentacles, and I say this to people all the time. The job market is bigger than the place that you work. So you need to cultivate your professional brand to include people outside of your organization, and always have a relationship with the headhunter. Because sometimes when it's time for you to go, you don't want that to be the first time that you've reached out to a headhunter, and you want to have someone in the organization, your mentor or your sponsor, if it didn't work out for you there, to be willing to be a reference for you to go to the next opportunity. And so one of the things, Yoshi, that I will say is DePaul has a really good career services center. There's often some bias that I have found in the people who work there, but utilize the DePaul network because that's what you paid for, right? And so someone, for example, might be willing to be less biased when they realize that they share something in common with you. And that's what I try and do a lot, is find a way that I have some commonality with a person to get them to overcome what might be a bias that would be in their heads before getting to know me. And Ruthie, I don't have any more slides, so I'm fine with additional questions.
Okay, so we have two more questions. Thank you to everybody for asking questions. So the next one that we have for you, Dr. Mason, is, would you consider the shock and awe of white people when they find out that you have a certain talent? Do you consider that to be a form of cognitive bias?
Yes. Okay, so so now I can give you all some real examples, right? So I gave you all my background. I went to the University of Chicago. I got an MBA in finance. I worked on Wall Street for more than a decade. And sometimes I have people say things to me like, in my present role, I didn't know you knew this much about the financial markets. Or I'll be working on something and I'll invite someone and they'll say, I didn't know you knew someone like that. Well, what do you mean, someone like that? You mean someone accomplished, someone senior, right? So it is implicit bias. And here's going to be something that might come across harsh, but it's true. Sometimes that kind of behavior comes from folks who don't even stand on the playing field with me, right? You know what I'm saying? I mean, it's often people who, in this environment, it's like a lot of these folks that we see mad because there was a brother in the White House, right? Or mad because, the new CEO of Walgreens is a sister, and they're just thinking someone took something from, she had to have taken something from them. No, she went to Spelman. She got a job. She did very well. She climbed. Now she's the CEO. No one gave that to her. In fact, Ross probably should have been a CEO 10 years ago, right? So, yes, it comes from implicit bias. Let's say this before I cut off this question. It's like, because I grew up during the era of the Cosby Show in a different world, and people were just like, oh, they're not real. What do you mean they're not real? There's plenty of Black folks like that everywhere you go. But that is a bias where people believe that we are some monolithic group of people who only do X, right? And so, yes, that is implicit bias. But that implicit bias is informed by the structural racism that exists in this country, which makes the examples of that so, right? So I don't know if that answered the question.
Ooh, Dr. Mason, I have to keep myself muted because I'm just back here like, yes, yes. But okay, so we do have two more questions for you. So this question is in reference to the wonderful pyramid that you showed. And the question,
I'll go back and put it up really quickly so for those who might have joined late can see it. Yep.
So the question is, what suggestion do you have about how to change the bottom of that pyramid and the current situation in the workforce?
Yeah. Okay. So I'll start with some of the pieces, right? Here, one of the first ones that I will say is this notion here of not challenging racist jokes. We often don't challenge racist jokes, not we just in Black people. I mean, folks in general won't challenge racist, sexist, misogynistic, anti-immigrant, anti-Semitic, anti-Islamic jokes because we don't want to rock the boat. We want to be perceived as part of the in group. The reality is people who would tell those jokes, they joke behind your back as well, right? So one of the ways that we can counter that is when someone says it or makes a statement, especially if something is blatant, that we, and again, not be confrontational because we are talking about this in the workplace. We say, Jim, I don't think that is okay, right? Not everyone believes that, and so I need to be the one. Now, what I will say is there's risk to that, right? Especially if you are a more junior employee, there is a risk to you being the one to challenge. But by calling someone's behavior for what it is, they may think twice about doing it, at least outwardly, the next time. Avoiding confrontation, whether it's with work folks, family members, or whoever, can be detrimental. Because what happens, so the psychologist would say, we get that fight or flight response. And most of us want to crawl under a chair, and then we harbor a sense of, you fill in the blank, that metastasizes inside of us. Because remember, clarity and forgiveness and some of these other things, it's not just for that other person, it's also for us. So we have to be able to release ourselves from the issues that we derive. So I'll give you an example. In my present workplace, I sit beside someone who is an outward Trump supporter. And I get it that there are people in this world that, for whatever reason, have a political ideology that is different than my own. And so as he would spew this, I would just say, XYZ, do you really believe he believes that? Or do you really believe that? Do you think it's okay to say that, paint the world with such broad strokes? Because some of those people that you're referring to or that he's referring to are your students. Oh, no, they're different. Well, how so? right? So thinking that through, or just challenging a person in a way that's non-confrontational, or when someone says there's good people on both sides, no, there's not. In certain discussions, there aren't good people on both sides, and we have to learn to, in a workplace, say it in a way that um, stops people from doing it again, right? It won't solve everything, but the jokes and that kind of stuff, it's not okay. So I know there was another question, so I'll leave time for that.
Yes. So we have one more question for you. Can you please share your thoughts on cancel culture?
So this is interesting because I often find myself wanting to cancel folks. So remember, we're a family, y'all. So you can judge, I'll say things and we can agree to disagree. So I'll use the example, like I really wanted to cancel Ice Cube for a minute this year. And um and I was having this dialogue with someone that says, well, you can't cancel someone for, thinking what they think. So I do believe that we are very quick to cancel people. And in some instances, it has gone overboard. But there is a difference. Yes, Ruthie, Ice Cube and Friday was so good. I like him. I lived in Brooklyn for years, so I'm much more of a Biggie rap fanatic and Jay rap fanatic. But I have to bang Ice Cube's greatest hits every once in a while too. So I was disappointed. But what I will say is that um, in this reality, sometimes people are overly sensitive, right? And sometimes we people are deserving of being canceled, and we just need to call a thing, right? So yes, I think that sometimes we go overboard with cancel culture, but sometimes folks need to be canceled. Because I'm sorry, Candace Owens should not be out here speaking for brown folks. Okay, she needs to be canceled. So if I offended anyone talking about Candace Owens, I'm sorry, but Candace Owens needs to be canceled. Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mason. So I have one more question for you, and then we will do the wrap up. And so this question is from me, actually.
Wait, really quickly, someone on this just put a chat saying her name is Cynthia Leggett. So my mom's best friend in the world is Aunt Cynthia Leggett. So you must be a good person, Cynthia Leggett, out there.
All right. So, Dr. Mason, now all I kept hearing when you were talking was a spirit of bravery, fearlessness. Where do you get that from?
One, I'm Southern, right? With a mama who was from this frame of mind. You just got to open your mouth because no one else is going to do it. But I think that the workforce, society will beat it out of us, because often the only way that we get to succeed is to be quiet. So I think some of it comes with age. But this is why it is important to find allies in the workplace, mentors and sponsors, because you want to have someone who will help you to speak out for yourself. Because what you'll realize is you'll go from being the meek, mild person to being someone who at least calls things for what they are. Everyone doesn't do it the same way. Whereas I might snap my neck and neck rock and tell folks off, that does not work for everyone. But I think we have to all lead in a way that works for us, because we all have different personalities, but we also have something different to offer. And sometimes, as my mother would say, being quiet is the best way. But being quiet and being silent don't mean the same thing.
Ooh, Dr. Mason, you dropping gems. Okay, so I'm probably speaking for everybody that cannot have their sound on, that's been like, yes. So Dr. Mason, how can people follow you? Do you have a blog or website?
Oh, yeah. So
I know they're wondering, and I don't want them reaching out to me asking me for your contact info. So would you mind sharing it?
on LinkedIn here? Let's see. I am on LinkedIn. Let's see. I'm on LinkedIn and Instagram, and so I have this LinkedIn group. You should find me on IG and on LinkedIn under this. It might be under, because I run the LinkedIn group on Wonder Women of Diversity, and we talk about issues in the workplace all the time. And I will, April, give you or Ruthie, the link to the event. So we're talking about diversity in politics, policy, and government in like 3 weeks. And so we have these panel discussions like this. And so we have so Dory McWhorter who's the president, CEO of YWCA Chicago, Karen Wilson, who used to be the mayor of Gary, and a bunch of other people who are going to talk about why we need to diversify politics, policy, and government for our own sake. So I will send an invitation out so you all can join if you'd like.
Thank you so very much. I am so inspired. And if you are feeling inspired because you are a graduate of DePaul, and even though you're probably paying your student loans every month, y'all, we have a very good network for the Black Alumni Committee. And so if you are interested in joining, our application process is currently open. We are trying to do more and more creative events. We basically trying to black it out. So happy Black History Month to everybody. I'm going to put in the chat our fearless advisor, April Garrett. I'm going to put April's email. If you are interested in joining the Black Alumni Committee, please send April an email requesting an application. This was by far one of the best presentations that I have ever seen. So thank you so much, Dr. Mason. And on behalf of the Black Alumni Committee, I would like to thank everyone for attending. And as a summation, Dr. Mason, I want to give you the last word because I just feel like people want to hear you talk.
So one thing that I will say, to carry you all out into the night is, we are a people that everyone wants to emulate. Just remember that when you are having dark days at work, my mother used to always say, the devil does not try to steal someone unless they have some worth, right? So the devil is not trying to suck your soul up if you don't have any worth, right? Because that's what it is. So just always understand that and keep your heads up. And I hope I get a chance to engage with you all again.
Thank you. Do you have an Instagram? I have two people.
Yeah, so I'll put it back in. This is what it is on IG.
Okay.
And my last post, if you come there, it's not open. I'll accept you. I just try to keep my current students out. My last post was about this time at the State of the Union address. The first time in history, the two people behind the president will be women. So there you go.
All right, Dr. Mason, you are wonderful. Thank you so much. On behalf of the Black Alumni Committee of DePaul University, we would like to thank you for attending today. And I hope y'all learned something. And please reach out to Dr. Mason. And Dr. Mason, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. We really appreciate you so very much.